forward to John to talk about the book more specifically, and then also one of the other contributors to the book, Peter Grave, who will have some comments to make about his chapter on Quebec. So it was, I think, late in 2009 that John Peters, very wisely and in collaboration with his colleagues at Laurentian, Ruben Roth and Mercedes Steedman, but also with Aaron Weir and Joel Hardman, who were both union researchers at the time, although both have gone on to much more interesting things. Aaron, who is seeking the leadership of the NDP in Saskatchewan, I believe. So John, leading this group of people, began to approach people in the academic labor studies community, including myself, to talk about putting together a regular series of books on work and labor in Canada. And at the same time, they approached Errol Sharp at Fernwood Publishing, which is one of Canada's most progressive publishers, long history of publishing radical, engaged, and rigorous scholarship, to see whether or not they would take on such a series. And what's important to know is that at the time, even though issues of work, the transformation of work, as well as the transformation of the institutions and working class agencies around the workplace and in the broader society were undergoing fundamental transformations, there's really no publisher in Canada who was systematically either commissioning or making space for work for the Canadian focus on work and labor studies. And so it is to John's great credit that he not only saw the important gap in our research landscape, but sought to fill it, took the leadership and initiative to fill it, to bring together people from across the country, both in the academic community as well as in the union researcher community, to think about a research agenda of books that could fill this gap. And we know that there is a huge gap to fill. The issues that workers and their organizations and communities face in the 21st century are legion. And in our discussions of what the series should cover, we talked about the fundamental changes that our economic structure was undergoing, industries growing and declining, all of which have had profound regional, class, gender, and racialized impacts. Along with that, massive restructuring and deregulation of the labor market, which has transformed the nature of jobs that people have available to them or not available to them, has resulted in a remarkable and rapid growth in precarity at work, both for low-income and middle-income people, as some other research that has come out just this last weekend has shown. That we are living in a time of massive income polarization, growing underemployment, especially for our students, that those of us who are in university teaching have to confront every day, that we're sending our students out into a labor market that is less and less likely to offer them good, quality, stable, long-term jobs, and qualities of life that we would consider to be dignified and worthwhile. We talked also about the transformation of economic and social policies that used to provide some kind of greater equality or shield workers from the excesses of the market, and the very conscious attempt to take those apart and expose workers to the discipline of the market with ever greater rigor. And we also talked as a group about the attacks, accelerating attacks, which have been relentless on workers' legal rights to bargain and strike, the declining influence of the labor movement politically, but also, and here's the less depressing part, the need to document and analyze those forms of experimentation that have been going on both within the unions, but also outside, experimentation with new forms of worker organizing to respond to the impacts of all of these dramatic changes. And so, as you can see, the series, the Labour in Canada series, has a huge research agenda in front of it. Luckily for us, Fernwood agreed with John's persuasive argument that a series was needed, and Labour in Canada was born in 2010. So I want to say that John in particular deserves an enormous amount of credit for launching this series of books. There are already 5 either published in the process of, some process of coming out or being planned. And I think what this reflects, particularly because as a group of people, we haven't had to really beat the bushes very much to find books. People with ideas for books have come forward because they have responded to the existence of this series and are so happy that there's a home for such research. But it also reflects how vibrant, I think, the field of labor studies is and continues to be. There are more researchers, both undergraduate, graduate, and faculty-based researchers every day grappling with these questions. And you know, John's vision to have this series be housed at Fernwood really allows us to bring together that intellectual community in a whole variety of ways, both within the pages of these books, but also at events like this. And I, for one, as a member of that community, am very grateful. This book, which John is going to talk about in more detail, really is remarkable in that it discusses, in some way or other, all of the issues that I just mentioned. It touches on the rise of the oil economy in Alberta and Newfoundland, the massive changes that this has wrought in both of those provinces, but also at the national level, the flows of workers from declining regions going to areas of resource extraction and the impact on the communities that they leave as well as the communities that they're going to, the macroeconomic effect of the dollar, of the high dollar on manufacturing and the communities there now experiencing, whether that's in Hamilton where I live, the declining steel industry, or Windsor, the declining auto industry, where I also lived. But that's not there's no correlation there, obviously. That this book also deals with the implications of the decline in traditional manufacturing industries. There's a really excellent chapter by Steve Arnold, a Hamilton area journalist, on the attack on the United Steelworkers, Local 1005, which represents workers at Stelco, now US Steel. And just as that union was a bellwether in the 1940s for the kind of post-war life that workers were expecting to lead, so too has it been a bellwether for the kind of life that workers now, unfortunately, can expect to lead with their pensions attacked, their numbers declining from some 30,000 in the early 80s to now less than 900 employed at US Steel. So the scale of that change and the impact on the Hamilton community is very well documented in Arnold's chapter. There are also chapters on government attacks on employment standards in order to usher in more flexible labor markets that are desired by employers. There's a case study of British Columbia in this book. There's a chapter by Wayne Luchuk, Marlea Clark, and Alice Wolfe on the rise of precarious work, but also the implications of that for workers being able to enforce their legal rights to occupational health and safety. and as well, union organizing in new industries like Aboriginal casinos and the challenges that are faced in trying to break into areas of growth with forms of worker representation. So you can see that this is an incredibly rich book that deals with some of the crucial issues of economic and social inequality at this time, explains what the sources and implications of these processes. And I think also, and this is another important part of the vision of this series, does so in a way that is accessible and allows for people who are engaged in trying to challenge these problems to think strategically about how to intervene. And so I think this is one of the really important things about this series, is that that these are books not to be moldering away on a university library shelf, but written accessibly in shorter chapters to be used in union education and worker education, but also by the general activist community. And again, I think that's a really important part of John's vision for what this series should be, and one that all those of us who are involved all share and are committed to. So, having said all of that and giving you a flavor of what this series is about, and let me now turn to introduce the man of the hour, whose initiative this is, to come and speak at greater length about his book. And that's John Peters, who is probably one of the most interesting academics that I've met. In some ways, has had a very unconventional path to his current position as a professor of political science at Laurentian. I don't know if everyone knows, but John was once a pipe fitter, and also I think a student of African history. So a varied life that has now landed him here in our work and labor studies community. We met at York. I think we actually met in Steve Hellman's comparative politics class and had a lengthy year of jousting. I remember it fondly. So I'm very, very pleased to congratulate you, John, on this piece, on this work, on this contribution to our collective thinking about what is happening to us and what we can do about it. And so I invite you to come to the podium and take it on over.
Great, thanks so much, Steph. Yes, I remember fondly jousting, and I think you weren't so fond of the jousting sometimes, right? However, I knew that if colleagues can joust and have a beer after, then you know that's what a colleague and a good comrade always have, right? So, anyways, thanks so much for everyone for coming out. It was really sort of terrible weather out there. It sort of reminds me of Dr. Seuss. Schlepping through the Schwab, I believe, would probably be the best way of trying to characterize it. And I'm sure if none of you have actually ever been to St. John's, Newfoundland, well, this is what it's like in St. John's, Newfoundland, right? There's rain, there's snow, and then there's more rain and snow, right? So then you have to kind of shovel it out. It's like the Catholics. Yeah. Anyways, also I do hope that even despite the fact that it's such poor weather, that you do go home with a nice warm heart after having some good conversation. There's wine and beer after, and that you'll be warmed by the good company as I will be by yours. Also like to thank the Center for Social Justice. Planche was very much responsible for hosting us tonight and doing all the details for getting the launch underway. Also like to thank again, as Stephanie mentioned, Errol Sharp at Fernwood Press for his support. Many of you know Errol, one of the most crusty publishers around, but certainly someone who actually supports really good ideas, supports left ideas and supports progressive ideas, and believes that if you do have good ideas and you can continue to believe in those ideas and promote those ideas, talk about those ideas, they can make us make a better world, and they can make a better society and a better future for us all. So I would really like to thank Errol. Also have to say, though, that sometimes Errol would be called colorful by some of us in Ontario, but I think in Atlantic Canada he would be called salty, as in terms of his feedback for both the Labour in Canada series when I initially pitched it for him, as well as sometimes his feedback on the manuscripts that we send him to him and the different ideas. So Errol is always much loved, but also sometimes a little feared. Quick thanks to Nancy Malik, who works with Fernwood in her promotion of the launch. A couple other thanks to send out. Books, of course, are always very much collective endeavors. Dave Mitchell, who some of you might know, but he's the former editor of Briar Patch in Regina, Saskatchewan, worked extensively with me in this book. And Dave is not only a fantastic editor, he's a great journalist in his own right. And now he's actually turning his trade to seeing whether he can be a communications staff person for the next leader of the Saskatchewan NDP and hopefully the next premier of the province. So that'd be great for Dave. Also really want to thank Ruben Roth, my colleague at Laurentian University, for being a co-editor for the series and seeing this volume and all the future volumes as well as they're going to come out. Ruben has always provided the kind of support that we need to sort of dampen some of my expectations as well as some of my terse emails to people. Finally, I'd like to thank Angela Carter, who is not only the most fierce critic I know of sometimes big oil and the tar sands in Alberta and Newfoundland, but a great editor, a warm companion, and someone who believes that good words and progressive ideas can make our world a better place, even if they do so just one drop at a time. So thank Angela as well. Steph already went through some of the big themes in the sort of chapters of the book, and so I'll be brief in terms of trying to get through my own sort of 2 cents about what I think the book's trying to do, because I do probably prefer a drink and chat with all of you. But the idea for the book, as well as for the series, really came in 2009 during the steelworkers strike in Sudbury against Vale. It was walking on that picket line that you sort of realize that you're dealing with this huge, large mining conglomerate. And after it had made literally billions and billions of dollars over the past 8 to 9 years, it was suddenly immediately pressing the steelworkers for huge concessions and job reductions in the wake of the financial crisis. And it was pretty clear that even with their record profits, that Vale was still trying to put the boots to workers and to the government. And I was struck, I think, by the parallels with the banking sector and all the other big businesses, both in Canada, in the United States, as well as in Western Europe, that were trying to do in many ways essentially the same thing. And I think, like many others, was left to wonder, how was it that our economy and our businesses had stopped working for people at large and instead were operating strictly on this kind of new winner-take-all basis? That is, what they thought that they could simply act with impunity and with little regard for government or for workers, and that they, in a sense, had this kind of idea that they in fact owned the community and they consequently had no reason whatsoever to either negotiate, let alone compromise, with either the workers or with the government or to listen to anyone. I think the other issue that struck me walking the picket lines, and sometimes you've been struck by many ideas walking the picket line too, was the actual economics of all this. You'd seen this huge, massive boom in resources across Canada. All other oil and gas and mining companies were making billions of dollars in the 2000s. But it was still pretty clear that while they were making billions, the rest of us, and Sudbury included, weren't actually seeing much in the way of benefits. Even in 2007, just prior to the crash, some 45% of all jobs in Sudbury were still being paid under $25,000 a year. Unemployment certainly had fallen, as everyone says, that you can give more money to the mining companies, that they're going to improve employment. But the vast majority of new jobs in Sudbury were part-time, temporary, and self-employed, and hardly seemed the basis for long-term improvement in anyone's standard of living. And once you began to look at it, both on a national level or provincial level, it was pretty clear that, in fact, Canada's economic boom was often just a bust for many. And especially in the wake of the financial crisis, when things were even more difficult, it seemed that Canada's economy, with its hundreds of thousands of layoffs, its thousands of business closures, as well as the fact that thousands upon thousands of people who were unemployed couldn't actually receive employment insurance, that the economy really was not necessarily for the majority of us, but rather for the few. So I thought it'd be good to contact Steph, Larry Savage at Brock University, Aaron Weir and Joel Harden, Grace Edward Galabuzzi, and a number of others to sort of begin to sort of say, what is happening across the country? What's happening at a provincial level? What's happening in terms of our communities? Do we see similar kinds of political economic developments? And do we see the same costs developing for workers nationwide? And I think as soon as you began to talk to people, it was pretty clear that those same trends were occurring. That everywhere you looked at both the national and provincial level, Canada's economic boom and resources in the housing market was leading to more income going to those atop. Everywhere you look, businesses are not only growing more economically powerful, but they're also growing more politically powerful as well. And everywhere you looked, it seemed that governments were either actively trying to reform labor laws and regulations to make the labor market more flexible, as well as labor cheaper for businesses, or alternatively, and this is certainly the case in Ontario, they're simply just sitting on their hands as employers took advantage of all kinds of loopholes. The fact that there's simply a lack of enforcement officers, and doing very little about businesses that were trying in all kinds of ways to get out from union contracts, avoid union certification and organizing, or simply hiring more people on a part-time or temporary basis, and then if they should go bankrupt, not paying them at all. I think just some numbers to sort of realize about the extent of inequality and how divided Canada's economy is relevant. I think over the past 30 years, you can see that the wealthiest 0.1%, that is the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%, has seen their incomes rise by more than 300% to an average of, apart from that big crash, yes, I know it is striking, that very striking, $1.4 million. By contrast, middle class incomes have actually stagnated. As the Conference Board of Canada has recently reported, median income, adjusted for inflation, has increased a mere $2,500 from 1976 to 2009. That's just a 5.5% increase over 33 years. So much for this idea that the wealth is going to trickle down. As for Canada's working poor, the situation is even worse. For the poorest of working families, they earned a mere $10,000 in 1990. 20 years later, in 2010, their incomes had actually dropped by nearly 10% to $9,100. And that's after tax. But the fact is that they're hardly alone in terms of trying to make ends meet. By 2010, 9.5 million Canadians like us earned less than $30,000 a year. Such numbers, to me, certainly confirm the general trend that the economy has been working to the benefit of the very few, and certainly it seems that it's been at the expense of the rest of us. It also explains why I think working people continue to go into debt, and why Canada, as well as the United States, now sees the highest levels of household debt of any other advanced industrial countries. And I think as a number of the chapters in this volume confirm, the reasons for rising inequality and the growing number of low-wage works haven't necessarily always been about those common culprits that we hear about all the time, of globalization, technology, or the lack of education. I think rather that, as many of the chapters show, it's actually about politics, and about how governments and politicians are catering to the concerns of business and the very well off. As the chapters on Alberta and Newfoundland confirm, it's these connections between business and government that have led to the rewriting of public policies and taxation to allow major oil companies to make billions, while governments have done very little to improve the actual living standards of everyday Canadians. Similarly, in BC, the line between business involvement with the Canadian government seems a direct one, and it's led to these massive numbers of changes to BC's labor policies, labor law, and labor relations. What businesses wanted, as we show in this chapter, business got. And this political influence of business accounts for a good deal for the rapid growth there of precarious jobs and low-wage work in the province. But what I hope makes this volume unique, and I hope valuable to labor courses, labor educators, as well as to those working in labor studies programs across Canada, is how it details that these political developments in inequality are not only occurring at some sort of national level, but in Canada they actually occur at the provincial level. And in some ways I know that this sounds like a typical left critique. All is bleak, all is hopeless, all is lost, we're not going to be able to come back. But I think we should keep in mind that if these changes are politically created, then I think that they can also be politically changed. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that you could certainly make the argument that the rich may very well be tripping up on their own success. Massive tax cuts have left governments with little room to maneuver to help them out. Huge investments in the tar sands and tax breaks for resource companies have created a glut of commodities on the global market. Free trade may have increased economic growth, but at the cost of the layoffs of hundreds of thousands of workers in the manufacturing sector. So I think the argument can be made that the rich and powerful will be far better off with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than a larger share of one that's continuing to struggle. However, in pressing for austerity budgets, tax cuts, rolling back collective bargaining rights, I think that businesses and the wealthy are simply undermining both demand and jobs, and certainly doing nothing to help the vast majority of Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet. Clearly, these developments mean that the economy cannot recover without an actual strategy to revive the purchasing power of Canada's working families. This, I think, means that there's a real opportunity for Labour as well as the left. Because if there is going to be a movement to push for a decades-long trend in widening inequality, I think we can make that push now. I think that Labour and the left can begin to push for investing in public education, can push to eliminate tuition fees for higher education, and can help in transitioning to a much more renewable energy economy. I think Labour can also begin to push much more broadly and much more boldly than it has for better labour laws, for increasing our minimum wages, expanding our safety nets, and actually protecting our manufacturing sector. And I would hope that over the next years, with this series, that we're going to be able to contribute to many of these debates and make some of these changes possible. We have a book that's coming out about climate change and how Labour has been involved in trying to push for much more sustainable energy and much more sustainable renewal policies and energy saving policies over the next few years. We have another book that's going to look at and examine the nature of low-wage work in Canada, as well as the activists and organizing communities who are trying to improve the situation of immigrant workers. We have another book that's going to look at union organizing and how it can possibly be done much more effectively, as well as some of the success stories, as well as some of the problems that unions have faced in organizing today. But I would hope that this book, as well as all these series, are going to provide a place where we can discuss, but also where others can join us in the effort in pushing for changes in everything from organizing and the public sector to improved renewable economy. And I know that many of these changes are going to be hard-won and they're going to be slow, but I would hope that this series makes its small contribution one drop at a time. Thanks so much, everyone. I'd like to introduce Peter Grafe, who's one of the contributors to the volume, and his chapter on Quebec was one of the ones I liked the most. Peter Grafe.
Well, thank you, John. You've had the boom of John's voice shattering the glass. This is going to be the bust. And the crisis is when you learn that he told me to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, so it'll be a while yet before you get to the bar. My chapter is on the case of Quebec. And it's going to be my challenge to make it exciting. But this is what I was trying to do in this chapter, and I thank John for inviting me to do it, was to try and make sense of what was happening in labor markets, what was happening in terms of economic shifts, make sense of what was happening in the broader labor market and political economy of Quebec. And really, as much as we like to think of Quebec as somehow different or exciting, in many ways, maybe this was because it was before the Maple Spring that I wrote this, in many ways I saw Quebec heading in a very similar direction to the rest of Canada, which can be useful in terms of us not fetishizing a difference, but thinking about ways that common challenges can be treated. And looking over a sort of 15-20 year period, what one sees, I think, really in terms of Quebec's trends is a consolidation of a neoliberal political economy that's familiar to us. In terms of people's expectations about what is normal for work and for income, and also in terms of a reduction of the sense of the possible, of what can be done through public policy and collective endeavors. What is different and distinctive? I mean, certainly Quebec is not the rest of Canada. But it's less and less the idea of a union movement that somehow is significantly different, either in its capacity to maintain a higher rate of density, a kind of planned sense, or a sort of more exciting sense of having a project of change, or even maybe a bit more modestly, a different set of linkages with the state that enable it to negotiate a richer set of labor standards or a higher social wage. In many ways, it's less that. That's still there. I think what would be pushing a bit of a difference through this period was the role of a variety of social movements pushing on labor market issues in their own way. And I think particularly an anti-poverty movement and the women's movement, which were maybe in fact more effective than the labor movement in this period. At least the unions as a sort of formal part of it in making some gains at the margins. So since the book is called Boom, Bust, and Crisis, I guess I have to say something about the boom. And in fact, maybe more so than in some other provinces, these were actually good years, at least in one sense, and that was at the sense of employment. And so in a period where unemployment was not below the double digits, really in the 1980s and 1990s, and stayed above 10% through most of that period. By 1999, it actually comes down into single digits and gets down as low as 7% before the 2008 recession at a higher rate of participation, right? So there's more hours of work, if you like. The average duration of unemployment too has halved from 1997 to 2008. So it's a sort of employment, period of employment. It's an interesting period. I mean, that to the extent you can speak of a boom for workers, it's at that level. But this still seems to mean that about a third of the employment will be atypical. So good times, right? Even in good times, the best we can hope for is for 2/3 of people in standard employment. So there's an important continuity there. Similar again to what John was talking about, right? I mean, it's a similar pattern of stagnant wages for the bottom half and a concentration of gains in the top decile. Right? And there's not much difference there. There's a similar pattern as well with the loss of manufacturing jobs, a growth of construction, finance, insurance, real estate, and then services, both government services but also private service sector. Right? So again, a fairly, I think, typical story of the consolidation of the sort of neoliberal political economy. I suppose one place which stands out in the Quebec case is that it remains a somewhat more redistributive welfare state through this period. We see sort of similar trends in income inequality and earned income, but after taxes and transfers, while inequality increases, it really becomes decoupled from the Canadian or the Ontario rate. And so the gap begins to grow in that period. And I think this comes from two things. First, an ability to tax higher income earners. And so there's a continued higher rates of taxation in the upper tax brackets. This may have something to do with the fact that the pharaohs in Quebec are less able to claim that they can move to this North American labor market to justify higher salaries and lower taxes. I haven't seen good research on it, but that would be my guess is what's going on. The other thing is at the bottom end, there's much more in the way of transfers, particularly to parents with kids. So working parents with kids see significant increases in terms of child benefits, right? So you see, again, it depends on family type, but you see something from 2 to 3 times the rate of the Ontario child benefit being transferred to said families. So that again has an impact on what's happening at the lower end of the labor market. Obviously, if you're a single unemployed, it doesn't look much different whether you're in Quebec or Ontario in terms of what the range would be there. Anyways, the result then is you get a welfare state that's about a third more redistributed in terms of taxes and transfers than in Ontario. So it's not an insignificant difference that persists through this period. And you also, I think, see some important differences in terms of the social wage around care and around leave. So the famous child care program, but we also can think about the better parental leave program. So it's a welfare state, but nevertheless, it does make some investments in this period, largely around children and around a particular form of work-family conciliation, right? But premised, I think, quite strongly on getting people into work, right? But there's a quid pro quo to that, which is maybe a bit different than we see in Ontario. So I think that's what's happening. If we look at unions, on the surface, we could kind of maintain the story that maybe this is part of the reason why Quebec maintains the sort of strength of redistribution, because unlike a declining union density elsewhere in Canada, it stays more or less around 40%, maybe trends down to like 39.8 or something by the end of this period. And that's like 11.6 percentage points different than Ontario. Right? So there's still, we're looking at 40% versus high 20s, which is not insignificant. And that reflects, much stronger presence, including in manufacturing and in health and social services, would be the sort of big areas where that divergence comes from. Below the surface, things seem a bit less healthy, I think. And most of this, in fact, comes from huge growth in construction. Right, so what's keeping that up is that you have real growth in construction employment and a capacity to maintain representation there. Meantime, you see manufacturing being important leakage, as well as in the primary sector, important drops in the rates of unionization over this period. In retail, there's a capacity to keep up, so the sort of coverage is at about 20% in private service retail work, but no capacity, so numbers are up, but no capacity to kind of grow coverage in that area. If you move from sort of, it's nice to be liked and have members, but the other thing is what you do with that in terms of collective bargaining gains. You start to see much in the way of gains in either the private or the public sector. So there's no real difference or growth in the union wage advantage. In public sector, employees likewise see their position fall back over this period, so it's not like there's much evidence of gains in collective bargaining around this. And in some ways, I think in this period, unions come to be seen increasingly as protecting insiders, and so lose some of their social legitimacy as leaders of some kind of other project. So I think is another important thing to look at. And in fact, the growth in, I don't want to be too hard on like the construction sector. In some ways, the growing strength of the construction sector has had effects in increasing this kind of view. And the papers obviously make much of corrupt officials and their $1,000 meals in Reno. Although there's an evincing sort of $200 tip that sort of shows certain class solidarity out of that. The papers bashing unions for supposed corruption is like nothing new, right? But there's a way in which this has, I think, led to over the past 10 years a kind of loss of the sense that the unions in some ways are leading the social charge. Now, of course, behind a lot of the social movement things that are going on, the unions are still there, right? So, in terms of funding, providing expertise, logistics, capacity to organize, right? So, one doesn't want to make kind of simplistic things that the unions have kind of fallen down, and it's anti-poverty groups and the women's movement and so forth that are pushing, because in many ways the linkages and the networks there are quite important. But I think there has been, despite maintaining a surface appearance of health, there's been a loss in union capacity. So both in terms of legitimacy, in terms of the real representation across the whole economy, the capacity to organize and bargain. But also, I think, through some of the forms, and this is less in this chapter, and that maybe more in the chapter I did for Stephanie and Larry's book, also a loss of the capacity to use their status as a policy insider. So the capacity to mobilize power within state, kind of more corporatist decision-making structures. I think there's been a loss there. So to conclude, because I suspect the beer's not getting any cooler, the Quebec model, if we want to call it that, it's not a gold standard, right? There's some things that are interesting still in the Quebec political economy, but we're still in a period where, in the best of times, you've got a third of the people in non-standard employment, retreat in union strength, stagnation of incomes. I think for the union movement in a kind of very narrow corporatist sense, this leads to very similar challenges as we find in the rest of the country. So in terms of organizing, what do you do in the private service sector, where you've got a legal framework that makes it really hard to organize? How do you face that? Bargaining, how do you pull up wages when you've got trade pressures in the open sector, and where you have very decentralized and fragmented private sector workplaces, which really prevent forms of pattern bargaining or ways of pulling wages up. So I think those are kind of common challenges that exist in both cases. I think as we sort of move from when I wrote this chapter to where we are today, these challenges remain. The Quebec labor movement has had historic ties with the Parti Québécois, but I don't see in the existing government that great a tie. There's the inaugural speech made no mention of labor, made no promises to labor. To the extent that there's been a kind of progressive aspect of that party tried to mobilize in the last election, I think it will be much more around questions of the environment, and kind of making that their progressive card rather than some kind of labor one. And that can have some interesting things in terms of changing the dynamic of, for instance, resource development. And we've seen a bit of tension around that, and maybe also the limitations of the PQ's fervor and religion on the question of the environment, as I think they've quite quickly stepped back from a more confrontational stance of their first few weeks in power. But again, it seems to me that labor is much less present there. I think the students in many ways were more successful, albeit for a very short period of time, because it's been a kind of unhappy tomorrows for them as well around this summit. So I guess the sort of final challenge again, which is maybe again a bit more the chapter I did for Stephanie and Larry, but also sort of tied to this, is renewing a political strategy. Because I think in many ways, the Quebec labour movement always had its own and different strategy than the rest of the country, where there was a bit more of a relationship with the NDP. But as the labour movement and the NDP have changed their relationship in quite fundamental ways in the past 10 years, in ways it's not so different from where the Quebec labour movement is in trying to find some leverage in terms of a partisan political spectrum where we don't have much in the way of parties that are clearly labour parties. And I think there's some similarities that are worth thinking about as well. That said, I think there's always moments of hope, as John points out. And I think we can think of things like the Maple Spring as interesting moments where conversations change. I think, as with things like, Wisconsin, we see the real limitations of, right, where people can bring the carnival, but then the relays to actually have some kind of form of impact on state power are difficult to develop. And I think this is similar with the students and the most recent negotiation. And so I think an important thing is to think about the very limited space there is for some kind of social democratic reformism on the one hand, but also the real, even the sense of those movements themselves in terms of their limitations to develop some kind of strategic alternative project because of the difficulty and cost that would be involved in this kind of period. And so I think that's something that shouldn't depress us, but it's worth thinking about, right? As we see these movements that are able to push and really fundamentally challenge the legitimacy of the duo and the return to things like banging on pots and pans and cherry berries and so forth. And the legitimacy is really in question. So I think now it's a question too of saying, well, what's the alternative that can be built to that? And so there may be a kind of setback from the student movement, but in terms of opening the question of what might an alternative look like, I think the Maple Spring gives us some hope. And I think there's a bit of ginger back in Ontario too, with thinking about what we might do differently, thinking about a post-austerity agenda, and that too should give us, I think, some hope going forward. So, thanks.